The air over the Carter farm was heavy that summer, thick with heat and silence, as if even the cicadas refused to sing. Jeremiah Carter sat on the porch, his back curved like an old bough that had carried too much weight for too long. His hands, dark and calloused, rested on his knees as he gazed out across the brittle fields. Once, those acres had been alive with corn, cotton, and laughter, but now they were little more than a patchwork of dust and weeds. Behind him, Ruth shuffled slowly out of the kitchen, her faded shawl draped across her shoulders though the sun was still blazing high. She lowered herself into the chair beside him, her breath shallow, her eyes weary but tender. They had given everything, every ounce of strength, every crumb of bread, every prayer whispered in the night, to raise the 3 children they had adopted. Michael, Sarah, and Daniel had not come from their blood, but from their hearts. When they had first brought them home, pale-skinned and frightened, Jeremiah and Ruth had promised that love knew no color, no boundaries. And for years, that promise held strong. They carried the children on their tired backs, filled their bellies even when their own plates were nearly empty, and scraped together coins for school books and shoes. Those children had been their pride, their reason to endure the endless toil of farm life. But as the years passed and the children grew, distance crept in like a shadow, stretching longer with every sunset. The laughter that once filled the farmhouse gave way to silence, to arguments, to sighs of dissatisfaction. And then, when age and poverty wrapped themselves around Jeremiah and Ruth like chains, the children turned away. One by one, they left the farm behind, leaving the couple to rot in the crumbling house they had once called a home. The silence between Jeremiah and Ruth that day was thick with memory, with heartbreak. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew the truth. They had given everything, and the memory of their children's departure was carved into Jeremiah's mind like a wound that never healed. He could still see Sarah that evening, stuffing her expensive clothes into a suitcase with trembling hands. The scent of her perfume lingered in the small kitchen, too sharp for the humble farmhouse. Michael leaned against the wall, arms folded, his voice sharp with irritation as he muttered about the dirt and dust, about how the farm was nothing more than a prison. Daniel, the youngest, laughed as though his mother's tears were a nuisance, brushing past her without so much as a glance. Ruth had reached out then, her hand shaking as it touched Sarah's sleeve. "We gave you everything," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of betrayal. "Every drop of sweat, every crumb of food was for you. How can you leave us now?" But Sarah would not meet her eyes. With one final tug, she zipped her suitcase shut and pulled away, the gesture cold and final. That night, neighbors whispered as the children walked down the dirt road, their figures swallowed by the dark horizon. Some shook their heads in disapproval, muttering about ungratefulness. Others excused them, saying perhaps the children wanted more than a poor farm life could offer. But the whispers, whether sympathetic or cruel, did nothing to ease the emptiness left behind. Jeremiah stood in the doorway, his broad shoulders trembling, one calloused hand gripping the frame as though holding onto the house itself. Ruth sank into a chair, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths as though each step the children took away was pulling the life from her body. That was the night the Carter farmhouse became hollow. The creaking of the wood sounded louder, the wind colder. For the first time in decades, Jeremiah and Ruth were not just poor, not just tired. They were utterly alone. The silence that filled their home that night was heavier than the heat of summer heave. The seasons rolled by, but the Carter farm seemed stuck in sorrow. One strong barn sagged under their own weight, the wooden beams groaning like weary bones. The garden that Ruth had once tended with pride now lay overtaken by weeds, their roots gripping the soil as though mocking her attempts at life. Jeremiah rose before dawn each day, not because there was much to do anymore, but because habit kept him moving. He shuffled to the porch, sat in his old wooden chair, and stared across the barren fields, as though sheer willpower might coax green from the dust. Ruth, meanwhile, grew weaker. Her hands, once so quick with sewing, kneading, and comforting, now trembled when she tried to lift even a cup of water. Neighbors sometimes spotted her wrapped in her shawl, moving slowly from the porch to the kitchen, her steps short, her gaze low. They pitied her, but pity came with whispers. "Such a shame," one woman murmured. "They raised those kids like their own, and look how they repaid them." Another shook her head. "Blood or not, you'd think adoption meant something. But I don't think those kids ever saw Jeremiah and Ruth as real parents." The Carters never heard the words directly, but they felt them in every silence when neighbors turned their eyes away, in every hesitant pause before footsteps continued down the dirt road. The children never wrote, never called, not even on birthdays or holidays. Jeremiah and Ruth learned of their lives through gossip. Michael's face in a newspaper for some law firm, Sarah's smiling photo at a charity gala, Daniel rumored to be working at a city office. Each story arrived like a shard of glass, sharp and cutting, reminding them of everything they had lost. Jeremiah patched roofs with mismatched boards, fixed broken gates with rusted tools, and worked until his cracked hands bled. But no matter how hard he tried, the land yielded nothing but dust. The farm seemed to mock him, as though it too had abandoned hope. And through it all, one bitter winter morning, Jeremiah awoke to a sound that froze the blood in his veins, a thud from the kitchen. He rushed in, his knees weak, his breath sharp in the icy air. Ruth lay crumpled on the floor, her frail body trembling as if the strength had finally drained from her bones. Her eyes fluttered open, and she whispered, "I'm just tired." Jeremiah gathered her gently, holding her in his arms as though she were made of glass. He sat with her for hours at the kitchen table, his weathered hands wrapped around hers, waiting for her breathing to steady. That night, while the farmhouse groaned under the weight of the howling wind, Jeremiah lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling. His heart pounded with the dread that their story might end not with love and laughter, but with silence and sorrow. He wondered if this was how their sacrifice would be remembered, two old souls abandoned, left to fade away in the shadows of a crumbling farm. But fate, silent and patient, had other plans. It was on another evening, weeks later, that destiny shifted. Jeremiah was up in the attic, patching a leaking roof beam, when his hand brushed against something odd, a loose plank slightly raised from the rest. He pushed against it, and behind the splintered boards, his fingers grazed the edge of an old wooden chest. Hidden, forgotten, waiting, his heart thudded as he pulled it free. The chest was heavier than it looked, its wood coated with cobwebs, the brass latch green with age. Jeremiah sat cross-legged in the dust, staring at it, his rough hands trembling. It felt like a secret whispered across generations. When he finally pried it open, the sound echoed like thunder in the silent attic. Inside lay brittle papers, folded letters, and thick envelopes. At first, they seemed like relics of the past, old correspondence yellowed with time. But when Jeremiah unfolded one document, his breath caught in his throat. A deed, proof that their land, long mocked as worthless, was tied to. Jeremiah sat frozen in the attic, the deed trembling in his hands. For years he had believed their land was little more than dirt and struggle. Yet here in his lap lay proof that it was worth more than he could have ever imagined. His grandfather's signature sprawled across the yellowed paper, granting ownership not only of the farm, but of the mineral rights buried deep beneath the soil. For decades, riches had slept under their very feet while he and Ruth starved and suffered. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring the ink until it was little more than dark smudges on parchment. He pressed the papers to his chest and whispered into the silence. All these years, Ruth, all those nights of hunger, all those winters of cold, it was never for nothing. Carrying the chest downstairs, he found Ruth waiting by the fire, her frail hands folded neatly in her lap. When she saw the stack of papers, her brow furrowed with curiosity. Jeremiah spread them carefully on the table, his voice hushed as he explained what he had discovered. Ruth leaned closer, her tired eyes widening with disbelief. "Jeremiah," she whispered, her lips trembling. "You mean to tell me, all this time?" He nodded slowly, the weight of the revelation pressing against his chest. "This land isn't worthless, Ruth. It never was. It's been holding something bigger than us all along." They did not rush. For weeks, Jeremiah took the documents into town, meeting with a lawyer whose eyebrows arched higher with each page. Soon, the quiet farm became a place of curiosity. Neighbors noticed men in suits walking the property line, pointing, measuring, murmuring among themselves. Whispers spread through the general store, growing louder each day. "What are the Carters up to?" some asked. Others scoffed, convinced it would all come to nothing. But at night, Ruth would sit at the kitchen table, her frail fingers tracing the paper edges like fragile treasures. For the first time in years, a faint smile curled on her lips. The whispers grew louder with each passing day. In town, folks speculated wildly. Some claimed oil had been found on the Carters' property. Others said developers were circling. But no one knew for certain. And Jeremiah and Ruth, who had lived their entire lives under the weight of gossip, now carried a secret that set them apart. For the first time, the stares of neighbors didn't sting. They sparked curiosity, even envy. Word, as it always does, eventually reached the children. Michael, sharp in his city suits, Sarah in her glittering dresses, and Daniel with his smooth talk and swagger. They had ignored letters, birthdays, and calls for help, but the scent of money traveled faster than any message of love. And so, one by one, they returned to the farmhouse they had abandoned. Michael was the first, his sleek black car stirring up dust as it rolled into the driveway. He stepped out with polished shoes that looked foreign against the cracked earth, his smile thin but confident. Sarah arrived soon after, her dress far too fine for farm dust, her perfume filling the stale air of the kitchen. Daniel came last, slapping Jeremiah on the back with a hollow warmth, his laughter ringing false in the small room. Neighbors watched from across the fields, shaking their heads. "Look who's come crawling back," one muttered. Didn't see them around when the roof was caving in or when Ruth could barely walk. Another whispered, "Now that there's talk of money, suddenly they remember their parents." Inside, the kitchen filled with voices, chatter, laughter, exaggerated affection. The children spoke of family, of staying connected, of making up for lost time. But beneath their words lingered something darker, something greedy. Their eyes darted to the table, to the pile of papers that carried promises of wealth. They masked their anticipation with smiles, but Jeremiah saw through them. He sat quietly, his weathered hands folded, while Ruth remained fragile yet steady by his side. Tea. The air in the kitchen that night was thick with pretense. Michael leaned back in his chair, his polished watch glinting under the flicker of the old ceiling bulb. He spoke of his success in the city, his voice smooth, but his eyes always drifting toward the documents spread across the table. Sarah chimed in with stories of elegant galas and vacations, painting pictures of a life far removed from the creaking farmhouse. Daniel laughed louder than necessary, cracking jokes, pretending warmth, but his gaze betrayed a restless hunger. Jeremiah remained silent through most of it, studying them the way a farmer studies a sky heavy with storm clouds. Ruth, though weakened, kept her gaze steady, her fingers interlaced on her lap. She could feel the weight of their children's intentions pressing against her chest, the love she had once poured into them now replaced with suspicion. "Papa," Sarah finally said, her voice sweet but sharp beneath the sugar, "we've been thinking. Maybe it's time we help you handle things here. You know, the land, the documents. It's all a bit much for you and Mama now, don't you think?" Michael nodded quickly, his smile tight. "Exactly. We just want what's best for you. If you let us take care of the details, we can make sure everything's handled properly." Daniel leaned forward, lowering his voice as if confiding in them. "You shouldn't be worrying about paperwork at your age. Let's carry that burden. That's what family does, right?" Jeremiah's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. He had spent his life listening for the truth beneath words, the way farmers listen for the shift of wind before a storm. And in his children's voices, he heard not love, but entitlement. Ruth exhaled slowly, her voice soft yet steady. "We raise you with nothing but love. And now, you come with sweet words only when there's talk of riches." The room fell silent for a moment, the only sound the creak of the farmhouse walls, as though even the O.L.